The most important part of the process was the planning of it. This consisted of me constructing a Gantt chart that had a day-by-day progression plan over the given project time. The chart broke down different key aspects of the design stage such as content production, etc. It also highlighted important dates such as rest days, dates for other assignments, contingency areas, and the deadline date. Alongside this, to aid the pre-production process, I did a SWOT analysis test to put my weaknesses and strengths into focus. This was so I could get a heads up on any possible issues. This was factored into the Gantt chart and helped me to implement the contingencies. After planning my time, I moved on to planning the actual proposal, where I began to piece together exactly what kind of level I wanted to create. I already had a rough idea of features I wanted to implement, which would ultimately coincide with the chosen theme. However, I wanted to get them down on paper as a point of reference. I considered color palettes alongside special features which would bring out the best of my level. Right after this, I gathered a gallery of reference images which would help me in making good creative and design decisions, as well as give me a good basis to work from. As I already had a rough idea of what I wanted to create, the images I chose were geared towards this idea. However, I also collected images that weren't in direct relation to this idea, so as to give the map some variety and diversity. Some images were chosen as they capitalized on ideas I already had, whilst others gave me ideas on where and how to place lighting and other assets. Now, if you look at the finished product and the reference images, it is clear to see that I've used a lot of the visual elements from these images, from the types of machinery, detail, right down to the color palette. Ultimately, my take on the theme was to be a futuristic, abandoned warehouse of some sort, which used to be a docking port for aircrafts. I had originally planned 6 rooms in total, each with unique interactable features. As the project progressed, this transformed into a dilapidated port where goods were imported and exported from other planets. I wanted to keep away from the traditional all-white clean future and stick to the grungy, rundown type of future portrayed in films like Riddick or Alien, but combine advanced technology displayed in films such as Stargate and Star Trek. The next level of the planning stage was to design my map on paper before using Unreal. To be honest, the overall size and scale was hard to determine without using the engine, but I thought of some rough numbers and knew I could develop them further once in engine if I wasn't satisfied. Although the designs are really rough, they elaborate and collate ideas in the reference images. For example, image A uses ideas from reference images 7, 8 and 9, in that it has metal walkways with metal trims and a similar color palette to all 3 images. The focal point of this room was to be a spaceship on a circular lift which would descend to the lower levels of the map when a trigger was activated in one of the 4 offices seen in the image. Design image B shows a side-on view of all 3 rooms. The left room was to be a room for nuclear warheads that would have a circular barrier which, when scaled, would grant fast access to the lower level of the map at a cost of 50% health. Also, 2 large double doors would be blocking the warheads. This was for aesthetic purposes only. The center area of the design shows the side view of the platforms. The final room on the right was to be a Stargate type room which had a large portal. I hadn't decided on where the portal would lead at this point. The third and final design image was of a very rough plan of ideas surrounding special features. The center image is of the previously discussed plane on the circular platform, and the image on the left of that is of a crane with a crate that could be dropped when a trigger was pressed in one of the 4 offices. Obviously, as time progressed and I got deeper into this, the whole design changed dramatically. Some ideas remained, whilst others were removed for practical purposes. Content production was far behind schedule, and at this point I already knew that I may have to scale down my idea to match up with the time I had left. Fortunately, the contingency plans within the Gantt chart, in conjunction with my SWOT analysis, made way of foreseeing the possible issues, and I was therefore able to prevent them from getting out of hand. For presenting purposes, I have broken down my map into areas to make the explanation of how the project developed much more efficient. Each area will have examples of development stages and a closing image showing the end result. Furthermore, to fulfill the criteria of the assignment brief and make this a true reflective journal, in each of the discussed areas I will touch upon issues I came across, how I overcome them, what worked and didn't work, and suggest what could have been a more efficient method of solving the problem. I will close out the video with final thoughts on how the project went. The first thing I did was map out the first 2 rooms in relation to the designs. One thing I had learned from previous experience, as well as advice from a lecturer, is to always test the game from the player's perspective. Therefore, I constantly use play mode to get a sense of scale and size. On doing this, I extended the room sizes and added the additional room. Soon after, I began to implement static meshes. The door was basically a simple frame with two floor type meshes which I use as sliding doors. This was the first asset that got me thinking about mechanisms and hiding meshes. For example, when the doors slid open in a vertical motion, I had to place a static mesh to hide where the doors went. I later went on to deleting the floor meshes and constructing a door out of additive BSP, and then later texturing it with something a bit more attractive and fitting. The walkways were designed and implemented into the map to add depth and scalability. It also helped in the exploration of the map, granting access to additional areas. Furthermore, rather than creating a large map, I could create the illusion of size within a single room by having levels. The initial purpose of the walkways was to help the player get high enough to gain access to the spaceship on the heightened circular platform. Further development of this idea highlighted design flaws. The large circular platform demanded more space than I had intended and would also demand a large enough basement level to the map, which when I considered the time left was not feasible. In response to the issue, I lengthened the walkways after finding a nice spaceship mesh, which fit perfectly. To fit the two spaceships, I extended the size of the room and the walkway length to make the room feel much more spacious. Metal trims and railings were added to the walkways to give them extra detail, as well as helping the player stay on the platform when shuffling in a firefight. These constructs were originally going to have computers with triggerable events to activate unique features around the map. They were to be 4 spread out within the same room, meaning 2 on adjacent sides. However, I changed this as I didn't want the map to be bombarded with obvious symmetry. Instead, I mirrored the office above the original and staggered their positions. The offices themselves were constructed out of static meshes rather than BSP. However, they had BSP roofs. In the end, rather than having them serve the purpose of triggered events, I saw them serving as weapon bases. This was because they stood out and were easily accessible. The lift was my first experiment with combining static meshes to create a single mesh. As well as this, it was my first experience of using meshes from dissimilar packages to construct a single object. The lift was meant to grant fast access from the lower level office to the second level one. I went a step further in my design in having the idea that every machine/mechanism within my map should be powered in some way. Therefore, I began to construct a complex power generator which powered both the door and lift simultaneously. In hindsight, perhaps this wasn't necessary because the player would not be able to see the detail behind the lift. However, for experience and showreel purposes, it was very relevant. The second lift was merely a copy and paste job of the first, but without the framework. This lift was to be placed in between the spaceships and used as a heavy goods lift, granting access from the ground floor to the spaceship level. After considering the practicality of it, I thought it best if it went from the spaceship level to the second floor. This was because there was already fast access to the spaceship level in the form of sloped walkways, so the lift was unnecessary at the ground level. Now that I had scaled down my idea, it was obvious that creating more than 3 rooms was out of the question. However, I still wanted to create a hydraulic lift feature which lowered the spaceships below the ground level. I began by cutting into the BSP to create a space beneath the spaceship large enough for it to descend into. I then created a platform out of simple additive BSP with a placeholder texture. Recognizing the benefits of combining static meshes for detail, I constructed a roller wheel and locking mechanism for the hydraulic platform. In completion, I added extra detail to the platform in the way of power cores and fuel pipes. To work with the roller wheels, I added a track to aid in the descent of the platform. To complete the mechanism, I added in large pipe meshes to act as hydraulics, and added 2 meshes to act as locking mechanisms for when the platform was fully descended. Later into the project, I realized that it would be pointless for the spaceships to descend below the ground level if visually there was nowhere for them to go once they were there. Before doing this, I found an actual hydraulic static mesh, which I experimented with, but deleted for the improvised one, as for animation purposes my version was much more practical. In relation to the additions, I began by subtracting some BSP to extend the spaceship port. I hit a brick wall for a brief moment as I was trying to find out how to delete sections of BSP to reveal what was beyond it. However, I realized that this may not be possible, but instead found glass materials which made the BSP transparent. This proved to be a much more practical solution. Realizing that this would expose the 3D space, I decided to make additions to my map which would transform my original idea and make way for better ones. I decided to add a space sky dome, which ultimately meant that my theme was now set in space. To strengthen the idea, I started to add space unique features such as a planet, space rubble and spaceships. As the concept was based around a main theme of a city port, I experimented with the static mesh building package as a way of implementing the city aspect of the city port theme. I built an attractive cityscape below the port, which I believe added aesthetic value to the map and gave purpose to the newly built area, as now the spaceships had relevance in that they were leaving for space. It was at this point where my map really began to develop, as the idea had now evolved. The final stage of this section was making the surrounding area more detailed, which I achieved by using pipes, wires, frames and support meshes. At one point I did get carried away and was trying to link the pipes in this area to the higher areas of the map, but had to rein in my enthusiasm, as the placing of these meshes wouldn't even be noticeable to the players. I then made use of a blast door and the conveyor belt to add to the realism of the area. This was the first area I lit and textured properly. I set my focus upon the outside environment when I started to think about the space concept. I started to think about how a city in space would hold up against the environment, such as comets, space rubble, etc. After experimenting with textures, I made a sky dome with a glass material which, when I stretched, looked like a force field around the city. I then added more spaceships and more buildings to the city. I drew designs for a conveyor belt system which hauled heavy goods from one end of the map to the other. I didn't know exactly how I would create such a mechanism, however on seeing the rail track static mesh and rotating it, I saw potential in the way it could be used. When it was rotated, it looked like it would work as the mechanism I wanted, whilst looking stable in the way it sat on the walkways. Furthermore, it added extra detail to the room. Using the same concept of the hydraulic spaceship lifts, I used the roller wheels I created and placed a few on the rail track mesh. After revising the original designs, I realised the idea was flawed in where the items would be coming from and going to. I scrapped the idea of nuclear warheads in the room on the left and instead had the conveyor belt machine running through to the first and third room. I did this by cutting into the BSP above where the doors were to create access points where the conveyor belt tracks would lead to. In relation to the third room with the portal, it was at this point where I began to mentally develop the idea of the items being pulled through the portal as some sort of complex import-export system. After this was complete, to add some more depth to the map, I experimented with a second level of the conveyor belt system by placing another one directly above the currently placed one, which worked. I then developed this further as I thought that these items couldn't just be moving to nowhere, so I placed spaceships at both exits as if the items were being transported from ship to ship on either side. The next stage of this conveyor belt system was the process of thinking exactly where the items were coming from. I thought of the first room being a massive storage room where a single machine would select, sort and dispatch crates, large equipment and other items for export. I began to construct this machine under the same idea of combining static meshes to create a single complex object. As I got further into developing the idea, I scaled it down dramatically. I simply settled for the idea of the machine being the brains of the operation, in the fact that it lifted goods from the storage room floor onto the conveyor belt, where the individual pulleys would connect to the items and pull them to where they needed to go. As well as this, I placed a machine at the end of it which would destroy any items of concerning nature. I had reservations about this final machine, as I ultimately wanted to animate this with some sort of beam that destroyed the objects, but at this point it was still all up in the air. The reason why the crane is worth mentioning is because its development helped me in realising the benefits of using oversized meshes in the design of another object. By this I mean, when making the support framework of the crane, when I duplicated and rotated the bottom half of the frame to make the top part, the structure was too large and went through the base that the crane will sit on. Rather than resizing it, I added to the extra parts to make a more detailed crane structure. I did this by adding pipes and other mechanisms. I managed to change the potential issue into an advantage. The watchtower was made from a set of curved, rustic, wall-type meshes. Originally, I meant to make a corner office with a single curved mesh. However, I realized that 4 of these curved wall meshes looked better when placed together. I then added a floor, resizing each of the pieces to fit well under the dome-like structure. I believed this to be some sort of watchtower and placed it at the highest point in the map. After considering its location, I thought it best for it to act as a base for the U damage or invincibility modifier. This was because metrics wise, I needed to balance the difficulty of getting to the watchtower versus the reward of getting there, as it could only be accessed through strategic jumping or through the air vents. The lift I dubbed as the complex lift started out as an experiment. To be honest, I didn't intend on making it. At first I was going to simply duplicate the slope leading to the ladder and the crane on the adjacent side of the map. Again, because I wanted to add more variety to it, I embarked on creating something much more unique to that segment of it. The creation of the lift just happened in all honesty, and I had originally planned on making it lead to a higher part of the map and another walkway, but seeing that it was nearly at the same height as the watchtower, I abandoned this and just had it as a lift. To be honest, it serves no significant purpose to the map itself, unless a weapon or modifier was placed on the part of the lift that opens out to allow the actual lift to rise. During its construction, I started to really think about mechanisms. The sliding mechanism on the lift is a combination of the rollers which I used on the hydraulic spaceship lifts and pipes underneath flat pieces of metal as locking systems. When making the sliding mechanism on the lift itself, I thought that in order for it to act as a proper mechanism, the structure on the ceiling on which it was attached to would also need some sort of rail system, which would slide open with the lift whilst providing structural support. During a brief time of analysis of where my map was, I believed it needed more features to portray a setting of a warehouse port-like environment. After a process of thought, I believed that I could make the concept more engaging if I made it a dilapidated type of building with structural damage and an open air vent system which would be a secret explorable area. Constructing the entire air vent system was a serious pain. If I knew then what I know now, then I could have saved myself a lot of work in using prefabs, but in hindsight the experience was useful. I made the vents by painstakingly piecing together individual bits of panel to create a single rectangular vent, and duplicating them in areas I saw fit. I had to do this because there wasn't a hollow static mesh for an air vent. Therefore, to be able to make it explorable, I had to custom build it. It was tedious because when it came to corners, I had to rescale panels to fit the smaller gaps, which on a visual aspect is frustrating because the textures don't scale well in a single local direction. The building structure was really easy to construct because it was a simple case of duplicating and dragging meshes to the right areas whilst avoiding the air vent meshes. Later on, I decided to add more detail to the structure and created what I called beam reinforcers, which were simple boxes made out of 4 metal type meshes. I placed them at the end of beams or where the structure would have needed support. The machine I've rightly named as the complex machine is the engine which everything is connected to. I wanted this to be one of the main features of the map and therefore wanted it to stand out. It was inspired from the reference images and a discussion with my lecturer about the construction of complex meshes. As I had already been following this ideology throughout my entire map, I wanted to go all out for this machine in particular. I started off by gathering every machine-like mesh that would look good in what I had mentally mapped out. I then began to fuse them together in an intuitive and aesthetically pleasing way. Prior to making the machine, I had come up with a concept that these small blue balls of energy were a powerful source of power in my adapted future, and I placed these on the machine. After I completed it, I cut out some BSP and placed the machine snugly within it to give the entire system a unique position where it would stand out. I didn't want any other meshes taking away its glory. I then started to build the framework around it of pipes and other meshes to give it a much more intricate look. Later on, I added some more to it. This was just for aesthetic purposes and a way to fill wall space. The final stage was building the lighting for it, which was a combination of yellow and blue light which complemented each other very well. What really helped this construction was the discovery of prefabs and how I could move entire custom meshes rather than selecting them individually. The smaller machine was just for aesthetic reasons to cover up floor space, and was really easy to make because it was a case of duplicating a smaller segment of the larger machine and resizing it for the location. I later added to it by using pipes and wires to make its situation look like it served a purpose to the map. After a discussion in a milestone meeting and prior considerations, I didn't want to texture the floor space. I have come across a lot of maps in the past which have a nice concept, but large open floor space exposes the looping of the texture and ruins the entire experience. After a meticulous search through the meshes, I found a very suitable mesh which could be used as a floor and suited the theme very well. I simply duplicated it for the required areas. Again, just like the crane, the oversizing of the mesh helped in adding more detail to the map. Inside the BSP of the spaceship hydraulic lift section, the floor mesh added a nice grill effect to it. As well as this, I added a base texture to replace the checkered pattern. The idea for this room had always been the same. However, the idea had adapted since the original designs. The Stargate Light portal that teleported players to the lower level of the map had now changed to a portal which would export goods to other planets and work in the entire conveyor belt system. Before placing the portal, I searched for a static mesh that would be able to serve as the portal. After doing this, I constructed door frames, trims and supports to create a nice blast door. From previous experience with liquid materials, I knew that this would give the perfect visual effect replicating the portal of Stargate. I later made additions of a mesh that added more complexity to the look of the portal and looked like it was a visual to the world the goods were going to. At a later stage, I cut a window into the room, which gave me a good lesson in how additive and subtractive BSP worked. This window was cut for visual purposes and allowed the player to see outside. Amongst all of the challenges I faced throughout the project, one of the most demanding was finding textures for the walls. The issue with this was finding textures that would complement the colour of the room and not drown out the lighting system. For example, a dark coloured wall texture would require a lot of lighting to re-establish the detail within the map. Furthermore, a lot of the objects such as the air vents were dark in colour and were high up, so the dark wall texture would make the air vent unnoticeable from the ground level. I first experimented with a concrete-like static mesh, with concrete trims as extra detail, but I realised that this drained the colour out of the room and made areas of focus unnoticeable. To compensate for this, I cut holes in the BSP in an attempt to break up the mesh. The first wall worked well with the window, but had to undergo rescaling to hide some of the visible exterior walls. The second wall and the window I implemented didn't work too well and seemed too forced, so I got rid of it. After experimenting with various textures, I found one that worked really well and used support pillars to break up the continuance of the texture and make the room look a bit busier. This room had a dramatic change in design, which was mostly down to the concept of the conveyor belt and import-export of planetary goods. Originally, I had planned for a room with large nuclear warheads. Then I wanted to have a room which descended into water, hence the large submarine. However, the space concept thwarted this idea. In relation to the conveyor belt, since this was where the goods were loaded, I thought to make it a large storage room with a lot of containers. However, from a design point of view, the depth of the room and the way in which the player would maneuver didn't sit well with this concept. I started to play around with a few ideas, but seeing that I didn't have much time to make the room very detailed, I mainly used a lot of the static meshes from the center room, and the idea brought itself together. The room then started to fall under a concept of a main loading bay, where ships would dock and unload goods from other planets. This would then be sorted and loaded onto a traditional floor-style conveyor belt, then onto my custom conveyor belt and sorted accordingly. The last thing I added to the room was a very large portal, similar to the one in the third room. However, I changed the style of it so that it was a large wormhole. It was at this point I wanted to experiment with matinee, as I wanted the portal to spin as the gate was opening. After converting it to a mover, I ran into major lighting issues which could not be resolved. This is when I came up with the idea that other meshes could be placed within the gate and they could be spinning to give a better feel of the machine working. I later ran into further issues with this idea. I was able to get the meshes to display, however the lighting effects I placed on it would not show up. This was resolved by changing the lighting channels to static or BSP. I worked in lit mode the majority of the time, but when I did work in on lit mode, the map was lit up by randomly spread point lights. To be honest, I was dreading constructing a proper lighting system, as this is one of my main weak points, especially in such a large area. past experience with lighting saw me creating large lights to cover a wide radius. However, after analysing the actual UT3 game maps, this was not the proper way to achieve good realistic lighting within a map. I went about first deleting all of the lights within the map and working from complete darkness. I had 3 types of light source within the map: a floor type light, a wall mounted light, and a ceiling and panel type light, which all ranged in different radiuses and intensities / brightness. Nearly every light within my map was placed in realistic places where light would be placed to properly light the environment. I didn't want the environment to be too bright, as I wanted to keep the room relatively dark and have nice shadows, but have enough light to accentuate the detail within the room. I had to play with a lot of the radiuses and brightness to get the map to where I wanted it. The only annoying thing about the process was that I had to constantly build the light to get a better idea of how it truly looked, as when it was not built, the lighting on certain objects was slightly distorted. The final stage of the map building process was to add a post-processing volume to each of the rooms to give the map a final element of detail, and add finesse to the entire look. I started with messing about with the mid-tone levels to get a feel for the different types of colour which could be achieved, and the effect it had on the tone of the map. I made the mistake of starting with really high numbers such as 100 and 150 etc, and it was only when I started to use very small numbers like 1.5 and 1.2 that I started to get the lighter tones I wanted. It took a lot of trial and error until I got a feel for the way it worked, and I found a nice brown overlay for the middle room which really gave it an industrial look, which was recommended by my lecturer. I also worked on the bloom levels to give the lights an extra visual boost, especially those that were placed on the walkways. I also made use of the depth of field modifier, which gave geometry in the distance a nice blur effect. The third room on the far right was given a nice turquoise midtone to give it a cool feel, more than likely generated from the more futuristic look of the room and the Stargate. The import room on the far left had a very subtle change in colour, and was not as profound as the others, but worked very well in the theme and concept. The most challenging part of the entire assignment was definitely the animation section. The reason for this was because I completely overlooked this segment and put so much work into the actual development of the stage, and because my stage was so detailed, I had to follow through with animation that would do the work some justice. On top of this, I hadn't really explored Kismet at all, nor did I know the true power of it and how much detail I could implement into my map by using it. Before I started, I had to get the map ready for animation. I had to first clean up all of the lighting, and after realizing I wanted multiple items to move in unison, I had to attach the relevant meshes together. Moreover, I had to convert all of the relevant meshes to movers, relighting the dynamic channels, sort all of the collision for the custom meshes, and formulate a general idea of how I wanted things to work. The entire process of animating was trial and error, to be perfectly honest, because for a lot of things I wanted to achieve, I couldn't find a tutorial on how to actually achieve it. The 3 initial issues were lighting issues, rotating items in Kismet, and later on I couldn't find out how to construct a working conveyor belt that moved both the player and items according to weight. As time went on, I slowly explored different features within Kismet that actually solved a lot of the problems I had. The lighting issue for interpactors was solved by lighting in the dynamic channel, rather than selecting the Be Enabled option. The odd effect that was happening when trying to rotate circular objects in Kismet was solved via ticking a box called Be Use Quanta Interpolation, and I managed to get a working conveyor belt after exploring a stage within the Unreal package and looking at the settings they used to get it working. Furthermore, I found out that I would have to animate the items I wanted to move on the actual conveyor belt via keyframes and edit their movement in the curve editor. After a lot, and I have to emphasize on a lot, of trial and error, I finally got the items moving how I wanted them to move on the conveyor belt. The last thing I really started to play around with was particles. I became comfortable with making complex looking animations and moving meshes, but the stage still looked lifeless. Therefore, after messing around with a lot of the particle systems and manipulating existing ones to create my own, I managed to give the map some extra life. All in all, I would say that the project was very successful. I enjoyed getting to grips with Unreal and seeing how powerful it actually is, as well as what can be achieved in it, and I know I'm only just scraping the surface. I managed to overcome all of the problems I had, as explained in each of the areas I have chosen to discuss, so overall I am pleased with the work.